A very warm welcome to everyone here in London at the Society of Antiquaries and to those joining us online. My name is Richard Linenthal, and I am the most recent past president of the Bibliographical Society. I will begin by asking the secretary to read the minutes from the last meeting.
Thank you. So the fourth meeting of the 133rd season took place at the Society of Antiquaries, Burlington House, Piccadilly, London, and online via Zoom on Tuesday, the 17th February 2026. Dr. Nicolas Bell, President, was in the chair. After the minutes of the previous meeting had been read and signed, Dr. Bell introduced Dr. Barbara Heritage, who delivered a lecture entitled Staying in Print, the Brontes, 1846 to 1876. When the meeting was open to discussion, the following took part: Professor Miriam Foote, Professor Nicholas Pickwoad, Kitty Shaw, Gazwan Boutros, and Karen Chase Levinson. Dr. Bell thanked Dr. Heritage warmly for her paper.
Thank you, Liam. Is this an accurate record? Thank you very much. Can they be seconded, please? Thank you. I will sign them. Thank you very much. It is a tradition of the Society that the speaker for each presidential address is introduced by the most recent past president. This is a particular pleasure for me. I first met our speaker, Nicolas Bell, when he was 6 years old, by my calculation. Not long before, I had moved to London and had begun working at Bernard Quaritch. Who would have imagined then, in a beautiful house on a very, very beautiful street in Edinburgh's New Town, that today would come? After completing a PhD on medieval manuscripts, Nicolas Bell joined the staff of the British Library in 2000 as a curator in the music department. In 2015, he returned to Cambridge to become the librarian at Trinity College, where he is also a fellow and tutor. Among other pastimes, he is the secretary of the Henry Bradshaw Society, founded 2 years before the Bibliographical Society, for the editing of medieval liturgical texts. He started editing book reviews for our journal, The Library, in 2003, and he has been involved with the Bibliographical Society in various capacities over the following years. This evening, he will be addressing us on a subject which is in some ways absolutely central to the Society's interests, the revision of the STC, the short title catalog. At the end of the talk, there will be the opportunity for questions. For those following online, please use the chat function which is available to you, and please give your names for clarity. We would be grateful if you would also mute yourselves. Over now to our speaker, Dr. Nicolas Bell, who will deliver his presidential address.
Thank you, Richard, for that kind introduction. The presidential address traditionally occurs during the second year of the president's term of office, and I couldn't help noticing that 2026 marks a particularly important anniversary in the history of the Bibliographical Society. For it was in 1926 that this society published the short title catalogue of books printed in England before 1640. The STC is surely the most fundamental and vital resource to have emanated from this society in its first 134 years of its existence. And it seems appropriate to commemorate this anniversary in some small way by remembering not only the phenomenal achievement which the early editors made in bringing it to completion so rapidly, but even more to observe the painstaking work which led from the first edition to the second. In telling this story, I'm greatly aided by access to an archive of papers which have lain undisturbed for the past 60 years. This is the correspondence of one of the 3 editors of the second edition, and another sometime president of the Bibliographical Society, Frederick Sutherland Ferguson. Ferguson has a central role in the story of historical bibliography in the 20th century. But his renown today has rather been eclipsed by those of his contemporaries who published more, such as Gregg and McKerrow. So if this occasion offers an opportunity to say a little more about this important figure, then it will be an added bonus. But let us start with the publication of the STC 100 years ago. And in fact, the antiquary's copy of the first edition is here in front of us, for those of you who aren't familiar with the first edition. The March 1924 issue of the library reported that STC should be in members' hands sometime before Christmas. This was not to be, as the proofs took a long time to correct. And in fact, the copies were not sent out to members until January 2027. So perhaps I'm being a bit presumptuous in commemorating the anniversary based on the printed date on the first edition. But the preface to the first edition makes it clear that the idea for a short title catalogue was first born in 1918 at a meeting of the Bibliographical Society on the 21st of January. There were many anomalies to that meeting when compared with our practice today. It was held on a Monday and not a Tuesday, unthinkable today. The president was absent, and no lecturer had been found by the secretary. So the secretary prepared a paper for discussion, which was introduced by one of the vice presidents. The secretary and vice president in question were Pollard and Redgrave. Alfred Pollard was already halfway through his 40-year tenure of the secretaryship and was soon to be promoted from assistant keeper to keeper of printed books at the British Museum, while Gilbert Redgrave, after a career as an architect, combined long service as vice president of the society with being a senior inspector of schools. He was also a very serious book collector. We actually know a good deal about the method of creation of the STC through Pollard and Redgrave's short preface to the published catalogue. The British Museum Library had published its own catalogue of books in the Library of the British Museum, printed in England, Scotland, and Ireland, and of English books printed abroad to the year 1640 in 1884. To this were to be added holdings information from the equivalent catalogue of the Cambridge University Library, and the major addition that would still be required would be holdings information for the Bodleian in Oxford, as well as lists of all books which were held at the Bodleian, but which did not appear in the British Museum and Cambridge catalogues. Meanwhile, Edward Arber had published his edition of the Stationers' Company registers for the same period, which furnished useful details not included in the earlier catalogues. All of this pointed to the Civil War being the best cut-off date for the catalogue. The Ferguson papers, as well as the piles of correspondence which I showed you in that last slide, include the original card index which was used to create the STC. It consists of 26,143 5 by 3-inch catalogue cards. Let's look at a typical example and follow Pollard's description of the process of compilation, as he outlined in the preface to the published catalogue. This card is perhaps a little messier than some, but by no means the messiest card in the index. It's for a 1612 edition of John Owen's epigrams. First, the main details were copied out from the British Museum catalogue of 1884. This was done under Redgrave's oversight. I haven't yet found any cards that I can say with certainty were in Redgrave's own handwriting, but there was a team of assistants for this project, thanks to a subvention provided by the Bibliographical Society. The details are abbreviated from the 1884 catalogue, which had full transcripts of titles, but it seems that it was only at a later stage that it was decided exactly how short the title in a short title catalogue should be. So here you can see that the copyist has included all of the title with only the name abbreviated. So it reads Epigrammatum J.O. for Johannes Oweni, Cambro Britanniae Libri Tres, ad Henricum Principem Cambriae Due, etc. That etc. does mark an abbreviation from a further list of dedicatees, but given that the STC entry, when it was eventually published, stated simply Epigrammatum Libri Tres, one cannot help noting that a clearer decision about the level of abbreviation of the titles at an earlier stage in the compilation of the cards would have saved a huge amount of time, as well as greatly improving the legibility of the cards for the benefit of the printers. Anyway, to continue reading from the preface to STC, Mr. E.V. Stocks at Durham University Library set to work on entering not merely the books under his own charge, but those in other Durham libraries and at Bamborough Castle. And here you can see DUR4, DUR4 has been written in pencil. That's a reference to the library of John Cock at St. Oswald's Vicarage in Durham, which was dispersed in 1929. So this holding appears in STC1, but not in STC2. Pollard continues, Captain Jaggard helped in like manner with books in Winchester libraries and in those of his own collections. And you can see here the addition in a different hand of Winch Coll for the Fellows Library at Winchester, later crossed out and abbreviated to WN here. Pollard continues, Miss Stainer worked steadily year after year in identifying the books with the entries of them, when entries had been made, in the Stationers' Company's register, adding the date of registration on the cards and tracking down many copies of which we have previously no note. And these 3 lines at the bottom corner are written by Ceccy Stainer, one of the daughters of Sir John Stainer, the composer. And the references here are to Arber's edition of the Stationers' Registers. Pollard continues by mentioning that G.W. Cole provided lists of holdings from the Huntington Library. Sir Robert Harmsworth from his library and George Barwick added holdings from Lambeth and Sion College. None of these feature on this card, though we'll see later that the Huntington's first copy was added to the catalogue at proof stage. They've since acquired another, in fact. So that provides the summary of where the information on this card was gathered from. The BM 1884 catalogue for the main text, holdings added in Cambridge, Durham and Winchester from 3 different contributors, then Stationers' Company information added in Oxford by Ceccy Stainer. Next came the editing. The name entry was anglicised from Johannes to John. The title was first abbreviated to Epigrammatum Libri Tres by crossing out the rest of the title, but then even this was crossed out once it became clear that the description would be printed as another edition. And then even this inscription was further abbreviated to ANR Ed. The imprint was abbreviated from Ex Off J Legati Sumptibus Simonis Waterson 1612 to Sumpt S Waterson. And the stationer's entry was abbreviated to Ent 11 SE for September, which confirms all that was needed to be known. An explanatory note was added that from 1612 onwards, the editions of the parts vary in numeration. At some stage, the cards were sorted into alphabetical order, and a running number was added for each of the cards for each letter of the alphabet. So this number 1412 is the 1412th card for a writer beginning with O. And then finally, and eventually, the STC number itself was added in blue crayon, 18987. Why am I spending so long deconstructing this messy card, one of 26,000 similar cards? First, it shows rather clearly that the ground rules were not established at an early stage. Had a decision been made earlier about the length of short titles or the format of the imprint, then tens of thousands of hours could have been saved. If Miss Stainer had known that the Stationer's Register details would be published simply as Ent 11 SE, then she could have worked at several times the speed. And if the information on the card had been less crossed out, then the compositor's job would have been very much easier. As it was, the bulk of the catalogue was typeset directly from these cards, using only the highlighted elements from this card, and with a clear expectation of the typographical conventions for setting each entry. I've also highlighted here the holdings information there, moved to the right-hand side and in the conventional abbreviations and the correct order. So the result extracted from this card is shown here. For the intellectual vision which led to the STC coming into existence, we have Pollard to thank. The precise level of Redgrave's involvement is less easy to pin down, but it clearly involved help with the financial backing from the Bibliographical Society, as well as coordinating contributors and some amount of actual work, though this was severely compromised by Redgrave's poor eyesight. He was already in his mid-70s by this time. But the work of ensuring that the printed copy was as accurate as possible seems to have been in good measure down to the devoted labours of F.S. Ferguson. Ferguson is thanked twice in the preface, first for providing notes on copies of STC books sold through Bernard Quaritch Limited, of which he was a director, and the final note is of thanks is for Mr. F.S. Ferguson, who read the proofs throughout and directly and indirectly is largely responsible for any bibliographical polish which the catalogue possesses. This was evidently the most challenging task in the whole project. My sense is that Ferguson checked through the cards before they were sent to the printer, marking them up with instructions such as for the indented note in this record. Then he collated the cards against the proofs, which must have gone through several stages. The proofs themselves do not survive as far as I'm aware, but we know from the preface that the proof corrections were extensive and expensive. As well as corrections of errors, a number of new locations were added at proof stage, especially of American holdings, hence the HN on this slide, which doesn't appear on the card for the Huntington copy. Ferguson was in fact helpful in meeting the costs of this extra work, as he persuaded the Society to agree to copies of the STC being made available for sale through Quaritch, rather than solely distributed privately to members, as had been the norm for earlier BibSoc publications, thereby increasing the print run and spreading the financial risk. So his involvement with the project was threefold: providing details of privately owned copies, revising the proofs, and through Quaritch, underwriting the production costs. A bit of background about Ferguson. He was born in 1878 in Stoke Newington, and after school in Hackney and a brief period at King's College London, he joined Bernard Quaritch in 1897 at the age of 18. He remained at Quaritch all of his working life, becoming a director in 1928 and retiring in 1947 after 50 years with the firm. He then spent 20 years of retirement working in the North Library of the British Museum on the revision of the STC, and died in 1967 at the age of 88. Like T.J. Wise and various others before him, he was allowed the use of a small office inside the North Library. This photo shows Ferguson receiving an honorary Doctor of Letters from Edinburgh University. His parents were from Edinburgh, and he was for a while president of the Edinburgh Bibliographical Society. This award was made shortly after he'd presented the National Library of Scotland with almost 250 Scottish publications of the STC period, which they didn't already hold. Because of his early apprenticeship at Quaritch, Ferguson was the last member of the firm to have worked directly with Bernard Quaritch himself, who died in December 1899, just over a year after Ferguson had joined the business. In his early years at Quaritch, before serving in the First World War, Ferguson had continued the work of the founder in developing excellent working relationships with the major American collectors, especially Henry E. Huntington, whose library was still in New York at this time, nearby to J. Pierpont Morgan's. In this work, he came to specialize in English pre-Civil War books, and his knowledge and skills in this area were further honed once he began collaborating with R.B. McKerrow, whose book on printers' ornaments in STC period books has been published by the Bibliographical Society in 1913. Ferguson was co-editor with McKerrow of the two subsequent volumes on title page borders after the war, and This collaboration brought Ferguson to a really heightened sense of sniffing out forensic details to assist with dating, for example, by observing cracks or flaws which developed in woodcut initial letters and which could prove the order in which different books were printed in using the same initial blocks. He was also clearly blessed with a prodigious memory for such details, which he picked up through the trade and maintained in various ways. He kept a card index of printers' ornaments, cutting illustrations out of sale catalogues and noting places where they were used. As well as the cabinets containing these cards, Ferguson's papers include large piles of pages extracted from sale catalogues and various other attempts at indexing woodcuts, sometimes based on his own tracings of woodcuts, as here. Although his handwriting is not particularly beautiful, he was capable of making very neat copies of woodcuts, tracing them. And sometimes he collected cuttings of original woodcuts. Unlike the nefarious practices of T.J. Wise, which we heard about in this room a few months ago, I have absolutely no doubt that these original printings were cut out of binder's waste and other damaged and unsaleable copies at Quaritch, rather than taken from British Museum books. Ferguson was not another keeper of a book hospital. But it will probably be as well to go through these records rather carefully in due course, in case there turn out to be any 16th century scraps, which turn out to have a particular historical significance or are otherwise unrecorded. Similarly, the Ferguson archive includes a few hundred rubbings of armorial bindings, mostly taken from books sold by Quaritch in the first half of the 20th century. These seem to have no particular order to them, and their future usefulness may be rather limited, but one never knows. I'll have a bit more to say about Ferguson's work at Quaritch later on, but for now we should return to the STC. Here is a letter from Gilbert Redgrave to the Times correspondent William Roberts, soliciting an article about it. Redgrave writes rather grandly, "England is so far the only country which has attempted a complete record of its literature in this way, and we are proud to have made a beginning and to have indicated the lines on which such a work should be attempted." As soon as it was published, requests were made for libraries and collectors to send information about their own holdings of STC period books. There was no immediate plan to prepare a revised edition, but the idea was that a few master copies would be kept up to date with records of additional copies and notes on press variants and unrecorded copies. The first edition was available for sale in an interleaved 2-volume version for precisely this purpose, and several libraries, including my own, have an interleaved copy on their shelves, marked up with local holdings and addenda. In the 2 or 3 years immediately after publication, these efforts seem to have been coordinated by Pollard. The biggest omissions from the STC were holdings outside the Golden Triangle of London, Oxford and Cambridge, especially Manchester and Edinburgh. Within a year of receiving the STC, Henry Guppy, the first librarian of the Rylands, wrote to Pollard enclosing a sample of their holdings for the letter A and offering to send a complete list if the format was found to be appropriate. Shortly afterwards, he would send a typescript of some 85 pages listing all their holdings, but including a great number of queries. Letters and lists such as this were passed straight on to Ferguson for consideration. Ferguson, meanwhile, compiled his own lists from various other sources. Here, for example, is part of his condensed summary of the holdings of Trinity College Dublin. Dozens of lists of holdings started to arrive on Ferguson's desk, some from diligent librarians who'd gone through all their shelves, others collected by a host of assistants who were sent out by Ferguson and Pollard to particular libraries to gather information, or from collectors who wrote to Ferguson aspirationally pointing out apparent differences in their copies from the information in STC and hoping to show that they had an unrecorded work. I've not yet worked out where Ferguson was keeping his master records of new holdings in these early years. It may be that there's an interleaved copy of STC1 lurking somewhere in the British Library, or it may be that his master records were sent to Harvard at a later date. But the editor's first plan was not, in fact, to issue a revised and expanded STC, but rather to create indexes by date, by subject, and by publisher and place of publication. First came the index by date. In a paper on future work on the STC delivered to the Society in November 1927, Pollard explained his first wish to produce a chronological listing or annals of English printing, and posited rather ambitious ways in which this could be made to serve as an index of printers and publishers, and have a simple subject index attached to it. Entries for each year could either be arranged simply alphabetically or categorized by printing city. This would be followed by a series of subordinate indexes of various sorts. But he worried about the significant number of entries for which dates had been estimated or guessed. And he ended this talk by saying that he was getting a bit old and he left this to the next generation to deal with all the questions he'd raised. Nevertheless, a project began of reordering the STC into publication year under Pollard's guidance, but in the main through the work of Miss Ethel Fegan, the librarian of Girton College, who'd overseen the Cambridge contribution to the STC. As a first stage in this, a complete copy of the STC was cut into strips and laid onto slips to provide an index which could be sorted by year and by printer. But bringing this into a workable form was complicated, as all those headings another edition had to be re-expanded. This set of slips survives in the Ferguson archive, and he and others seem to have had this index in use for some years, as there are various annotations, especially in the correction of errors which Ferguson or Miss Fegan noticed, or which were drawn to their attention. By December 1936, this project seems to have been well advanced, and some sample pages were typeset. A proof of one page is shown here. This is actually rather different from what Pollard had been positing in 1927, where he suggested just having a single line entry for each book to make it easier to browse through. But the project was not completed before the outbreak of war, and the impetus never seems to have come back for it to be resumed as a printed project. Instead, the title slips arranged by year were kept in the North Library in the British Museum, and after the war, Allardyce Nicoll prepared a chronological index at the Shakespeare Institute in Stratford, but this was never intended for publication. Later, it's difficult to work out exactly when, but I suspect this mostly happened in the 1950s. Ferguson replaced his index of slips cut from the printed STC with a series of typed index cards, 6 by 4 inches this time instead of 5 by 3, which included collations of all books. He had these arranged by city or town of publication, then printer, then date, and these cards provided an invaluable function up until the index volume of STC2 was completed in 1991. In fact, they still include a good amount of information not stored systematically anywhere else, as Ferguson consistently notes any printing ornaments, initial letters, or similar printer's devices in each book, and the pages on which they're to be found. STC2 includes details of many more collations than the first edition did, but there's often more information to be found on these cards, so it would seem that there's still a certain amount of research potential lying in these drawers. Meanwhile, in the 1940s, Paul Morrison of Chicago was working on an index of printers, publishers, and booksellers, which was issued by the Bibliographical Society of America in 1950. As far as I've been able to tell, this was entirely his own work and was undertaken quite independently of the home team of STC revisers. And meanwhile, Dr. Henry Adelbert White of the University of Nebraska began compiling a subject index to the STC, which likewise never reached published form, but which became a useful point of access in its provisional form for many researchers. White proceeded with this grand project for several years after the war, with research trips to various collections to aid his work. But it was never really feasible to imagine that such a large project could be undertaken single-handedly. What is perhaps more surprising is that a subject index was never considered a major priority by the main protagonists. After all, the majority of modern readers of 16th century books were likely to be looking for particular types of book based on their content, more than their precise date of printing or the name of their printer. Here, I speculate that we can see an element of Ferguson's personality coming through. Pollard had died in 1944 at the age of 84, but had essentially handed over responsibility for STC a few years after its publication. Redgrave predeceased him in 1941, but at the fine age of 97, and he doesn't seem to have been involved at all after the publication in 1926. Ferguson had been so closely involved throughout the years of preparation of STC in 1919 to 26, and was the natural heir of the catalogue, but seems to have had very clear ideas about what was most important and what was not. I mentioned before that his attention to detail was unparalleled, and it's fair to attribute some of this close analytical skill to his work with Maquereau, who also specialized in that approach. Ferguson's other great influence in his early days at Quaritch and throughout the Edwardian period was surely his most important client, Mr. Henry E. Huntington. In the Ferguson papers are dozens of letters, not from Huntington himself, but from his librarians, especially the great George Watson Cole, who assumed this position in 1915, who wrote repeatedly to him, asking wonderfully erudite and precise comparative details between the books Quaritch had sold to Huntington and any similar copies in the British Museum or elsewhere. Huntington's interests were especially in English books pre-Civil War, and his ambition seemed to be to accumulate them as comprehensively as possible. It was partly the dominance of sales of these books to Huntington under Ferguson's direction during the quarter century after Bernard Quaritch's death that led to the firm of Quaritch coming to specialize so strongly in this area. We should recall that in the 19th century, Quaritch was selling new books as well as old, and had various specialisms, including in Oriental books, which became rather less predominant in the 20th century. So I would contend that Ferguson was influenced from two sides. From selling to Huntington, he had the impetus to find as many variant states and other press anomalies as possible. And through his work with Maquereau, he honed his skills in discerning press variants and the reuse of type and ornaments by different printers. And in both cases, almost his sole focus was on STC period books, and his sole interest was in establishing their correct bibliographical data. What is most noticeable in the few thousand letters in Ferguson's papers, and I can't claim to have read them all, is the almost complete absence of discussion of anything about STC books other than those most purely bibliographical questions: type, collation, imprint, the questions of how to discern the date for an undated work. Among the giants of the bibliographical world at the start of the last century, it's noticeable that Ferguson seemed more aligned with Maquereau than with, say, Gregg or Pollard, whose interests spread much more widely and who were clearer in seeing bibliography as a means to an end. Gregg's work on Elizabethan plays was obviously helped by the publication of the STC, but it would have required a subject index to be published before anyone could systematically use it to find plays other than by author's name. And the same applied for any other subject of study. In effect, STC is of no use to anyone wishing to find books about falconry or demonology or arboriculture or anything, unless one already knows the names of authors. In these days of a fully searchable and fully subject-indexed ESTC, it's as well to remember the limitations of a purely alphabetical catalogue. But to Ferguson, the main priority was not providing new means of access to the data already published. Far more important was the preparation of a new revised edition with added holdings information, corrections of errors, more precise estimations of dates for undated materials, and editions of new discoveries. His high expectations of accuracy were the stuff of legend, and this could make him quite a difficult character to approach. This personality trait also had its effect on his responsibilities for running the business of Quaritch. And perhaps the best character portrait of him that I've seen in print was written by Ted Dring, whose father had joined Quaritch in 1877, and he himself would spend all his life there too. He gave a talk in 1978 that was published in the special issue of the Book Collector in 1997 to mark the 150th anniversary of the founding of Quaritch, where he says, "There were at least three Fergusons. Firstly, the family man whose children always had to pass all exams at the top. Secondly, the managing director who was quite impossible, and if I speak disparagingly, it is always of him in this guise. And lastly, the pipe-smoking student of bibliography, he was always a student, who liked his whiskey, was a delight to all, whose time and knowledge were always at one's disposal, and whose fund of anecdotes was inexhaustible. It was really rather sad. He was at heart a bibliographer and researcher, but was put to run a firm of some 40 people and had no conception of how to do it." After Bernard Quaritch's death in 1899, the running of the business had passed to his son, Bernard Alfred Quaritch. And on his death in 1913, the business passed to his two sisters, and E.H. Dring, the father, was appointed as manager. Bernard Quaritch's two sons-in-law were also appointed directors, so it remained almost entirely in family ownership until Ferguson was made a director too in 1928. That was just after the death of E.H. Dring, Dring Sr. The firm was already suffering from the results of the Great Depression by then, and this came to a head in 1934 when Sotheby's asked for their account to be paid, which had become very substantially overdrawn. Ferguson was not good at dealing with this, while the family directors were much less directly involved in running the business. But much worse was to come when one of Quaritch's grandsons, Dr. H.G. Quaritch Wales, was appointed a director by the family in 1939. Ferguson was antipathetic to him from the start. This is a letter from 3 years into Dr. Quaritch Wales's appointment as a director, when he had been sent to New York with a large consignment of books to sell them as cheaply as, well, not as cheaply as possible, but at a considerable reduction from the prices that Ferguson was accustomed to charging for such books before the Depression. And you can see in this letter the angry tone when he says that you and your fellow directors, but not with my approval, have allowed him to sell books at a fantastic discount off the selling prices, slaughtering them, as two of the staff have rightly termed it, to be paid a similarly unbusinesslike commission and to incur expenses for which no proper account was rendered, besides incurring the displeasure of the board in acting against his instructions as recorded in our minutes. There's a large number of letters, there's a large body of paperwork between Ferguson and the directors still in the family, showing a great number of acrimonious disputes that Ferguson held with the members of the Quaritch family, and specifically this one. And in fact, this Dr. Wales's aunt, Charlotte Wentmore, who was Bernard Quaritch's daughter, tried very hard and very diplomatically to mediate between these opposing opinions. But it quickly became impossible, and in fact, it was something of a relief when Ferguson was deprived of his directorship in the autumn of 1943. But he remained in the employment of the firm until 1947, which was the centenary of the foundation of the company. He was also he found it very difficult to lay off staff. As Ted Dring mentioned, he'd inherited 40 staff, which was far too many given that there was no trade happening with the American collectors anymore. And he favoured some staff over others. It became clear these were the accusations made against him by the co-directors. But to return to the STC, this became Ferguson's main occupation in the years after his retirement from Quaritch in 1947. And in this work, he was closely aided and abetted by William A. Jackson, the first librarian of the Houghton Library at Harvard. Jackson, I think, had come over to England at some point at various points in the 30s. In fact, the first letter I found from him among the Ferguson papers is this one dated 1937. This was 2 years before he was appointed to Harvard. I mean, the Houghton Library wasn't named that until slightly after his appointment. But at this point, he was spending most of his time in the Grolier Club. And it's a very characteristic letter saying, I found, I believe, the printer of the Pills to Purge Melancholy. And he's based it not on the type, he's based it on analysing the type and the floriated I on recto A3, etc. This is exactly the sort of letter that Ferguson loved to receive and would spend the whole day working through rather than dealing with the problems that were oppressing him under the Great Depression. There are probably 400 letters from Bill Jackson to his close friend Fergie in this archive. And there you can see that there's a very, they were very close friends. They were always asking the smallest bibliographical details. It's a really fascinating correspondence, half of it in the Ferguson papers and the other half in Harvard. Although I haven't looked at the papers in Harvard, but I suspect since most of Jackson's letters are typed that he kept carbon copies of them because he needed to remember exactly how he'd posed the question in order to understand the answer. So that correspondence really is an inspiring read for any budding bibliographer. Now, if the presidential address is an occasion on which I may crave your indulgence, then let me try to draw together some conclusions from this overview. Oh, that was too soon. I should go back. I thought there was a blank in between. First, the idea of the STC was conceived by Pollard, a scholar librarian, and Redgrave, a collector. And the work was undertaken by a team of scholars, librarians, collectors, and in Ferguson, a noted bookseller. The success of the project depended on the input of these many different points of view. Each has a distinct but overlapping interest in the same materials. And this broad range of approaches was a distinctive aspect of the Bibliographical Society 100 years ago, and I think it remains so today. The Society's council continues to have a good mix on it of librarians, booksellers, collectors, and scholars. And I don't list those four categories in any meaningful order, and there are, of course, overlaps between all four of them. But it was only this convergence of interests which allowed the STC to come into being, and it's fundamental to its continuation in STC2 and the feeding of that information into ESTC. But I suppose another question I have is, what do we do with this archive? I haven't even told you where it is. In fact, I found it in a cupboard in the corner of the reading room of the Library of Trinity College, Cambridge. It was deposited there, dumped there, in fact, in 1997, because it had remained in the North Library of the British Museum following Ferguson's death, and became an anomaly in the British Library when it moved to the new building, because it was not in the Department of Manuscripts, therefore was not a manuscript, and it was not printed, therefore it was not part of the Department of Printed Books. So it was rescued by a predecessor of mine, but only to the extent of being abandoned in another corner. So I suppose my question to you, it really is to ask, is it of any use? And if so, what use and where should it be? Some parts of it would seem to belong to suit the British Library rather well. For example, the card index of collations, which is not yet superseded by ESTC or STC2. Another possibility would be that this, in as much as this is mainly the archive of the short title catalogue, its property should be vested in the Bibliographical Society, which was the publisher of both STC and STC2. Another possibility would be for it to be moved to Harvard, to the Houghton Library, which already has 138 linear feet of STC papers, mainly from the time after Jackson and Ferguson had died, when the project was taken over by Kitsy Pantzer. And in fact, that was my last slide to show you, because I didn't know about these until I found among the papers. Whenever Kitsy Pantzer had reached the end of a letter in her editing of, you'll recall that when Bill Jackson died, he'd reached the letter R and thought that the first volume was ready to be published. The second volume would be ready in about 5 years. And Kitsy Pantzer had a different idea, because she revised all of the revisions that had already been made. So it was easier to publish the second volume first, because she knew that from M onwards was completely sound, because she had overseen it. And whenever she reached the end of a letter, she would make a lino cut demonstrating her achievement in having completed that letter. So there are a few of them. She had, she sent these to Pollard. I think by the time she reached R, he had to Ferguson. By the time she reached R, Ferguson had died. So I just have these 3 booklets, which I can leave on the table for you to see, for those of you who may not have seen the lighter side of Kitsy Pantzer's work. And I pronounce her name correctly now, thanks to her explanation in the pamphlet for the letter O. The other possibility, of course, would be for this archive or parts of it to be returned to Bernard Quaritch, because there are significant portions of it that relate to the administration of Quaritch. However, I think Ferguson was rather careful in keeping these as his personal papers as a director of the company, rather than as part of the corporate archive. They certainly shed a great deal of light in rather interesting ways on the work of Quaritch, especially between 1934 and 1947. So perhaps the best solution is for them to remain in Trinity College. I say this not out of self-interest, because it would be a huge encumbrance to have to deal with them properly, which is why they've been lingering in a cupboard for several decades. But I think that there is an opportunity to do some things with them. I think it's an appropriate place for them to be, alongside several other archives of notable bibliographers, including Gregg and McKerrow. There are many other parts of this archive that I haven't been able to touch on just now. There are several letters from E.P. Goldschmidt, Sidney Cockrell, Gregg and McKerrow and Pollard, but also Tim Munby and Geoffrey Keynes. So there are little details that I think it would be useful for people to be aware of, so that they could come and look at them. Whether there are more uses that could be put to the various the 4 card indexes, the original cards for STC1, the laid down title slips arranged in date order from STC1, annotated by Ferguson, Ferguson's larger index of printers' ornaments laid onto blue cards, and Ferguson's catalogue of collations and lists of printers' ornaments in individual volumes, is a separate question. Dealing with indexes generally is difficult, making them accessible in useful ways, but they are available. So really the purpose of this talk has just been to let you know of their existence and to invite you to come and see them if you think that anything here might be of interest to you. Thank you.